Yep, it is. Okay, this is Harold Smith with the Sheldon Historical Society. I'm here today with Bob Little Sr., capturing some of his memories from having been born and raised in Sheldon, Vermont. So, hi, Bob.
Hi, Harold.
So you were born in what year?
I was born in 1942.
Okay. And where?
I was born in Sheldon. My birth certificate says I was born in St. Albans Hospital, the old St. Albans Hospital.
Right.
And we lived, my father and mother lived in Sheldon Springs at the time.
Well, where was that in Sheldon Springs they lived?
It was, we occupied a apartment above the Missisquoi Market.
Oh, yes.
My father was employed at the Missisquoi Market at that time.
Okay.
And his father and mother lived on what was called Little's Corners in Sheldon, which is on the Macy Road, close to the Macy Road, which is, I think, is now called Roy's Corner, or
Yeah.
maybe that part I don't know, but for a period of time, I had two sisters and myself living in Sheldon Springs.
Mm-hmm.
My father started working at the mill, and we moved back to the farm on a temporary basis till he purchased the house in Sheldon Village,
Okay.
or the
that's
creek.
called, that's called the Creek. And which house was that?
This is a house that's currently right next door to the post office. When we owned or moved there, the post office was really in the building, excuse me, that is now called the Historical Society's main building. And that building was owned by the Mercures.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Mercure and I were good friends.
Jim's down in South Carolina right at the moment. I
So
know Jim quite well.
good. I have not kept in touch with a lot of people that are there, but a lot of my friends did stay in Sheldon for quite a few years.
Right. So, at one point in time, what is now the post office was actually a school, but that was before Mercury's.
Yes.
Yeah.
We only witnessed, I guess, it being rented. There was at least two different families that I know of that lived in that building while we were there.
And how old were you when you moved there?
I was approximately 4, maybe 5 years old. I'm trying to get in relationship. My younger brother,
So
was
you
born when we moved there.
So you went to school in the Creek
Yes, we did, all 8 years.
all 8 years. That was one on top of the hill, the big building where
Yes.
Jack Dufresne now has a place up in there.
Yes.
And you went there for 8 years. Tell me, who was your best friend at that point in time?
Primarily Gilbert Spalding.
Okay.
Gilbert was known to me and has been known to me as Birdie Spalding all these years. I pretty much say that we were the best of friends until we got out of high school, I think, at that time.
Okay. Who do you remember being a teacher at that school of yours?
My first grade teacher was Mrs. Phillips,
Okay.
Leona Phillips, and she had a son called Gary Phillips. Gary and I were palled around, but Gary was a couple of years older than me. So we did associate because he was almost right across the road from where I lived.
Right.
But primarily, Birdie Spalding was my best friend.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then you would have left your house on Main Street and walked to school.
Yes, we did.
Okay, you were going down Main Street, down Bridge Street.
Down Bridge Street.
Okay, take me down Bridge Street. Tell me
Down-
what's there.
We primarily walked in the road, but there were sidewalks on both sides. So I mean, as kids do, we all kind of walked with our sisters and brothers and all because we all did that. We would walk to school. At noontime, we'd turn around and walk home, have lunch, turn around, go back, and have another session, and then we come back home. On the way to that school, we would pass by the Tillotson store.
It would be the one on the right-hand side.
It would be on the right-hand side. Sheridan Cattell operated the store on the left-hand side, and at that time, I guess the competition between the two stores of the more busier one was the Tillotson store.
Mm-hmm.
We would continue down the street and cross the bridge. Now the bridge was always a big attraction, and we did daredevil things on that we probably should not have, and our parents didn't want to know about it. But we'd go up the hill, cross the railroad tracks, up the hill, and go to school.
So the railroad was still running in 1947, 48, 49.
Yes, when we first moved to the village, to the creek, we could see the river from the back of our house, and along the edge of that river was the railroad tracks. We witnessed, and we could pretty much see it before it was coming, was the train coming from Sheldon Junction.
Mm-hmm.
Big clouds of black smoke. That was the old coal burning train that came through, and it would continually chug, and the smoke would billow through the trees, and pretty quick you'd see the train, and eventually it'd go through. That was replaced shortly by the diesel engine, and you still could hear that. But the biggest thing I remember about that was the clanging of the bell. It seemed like there was a bell, as it moved along. And it was a big source of aggravation to the church members on Sundays when the train would come through.
That'd be the
and
Methodist Church, yes.
That would be the Methodist church. And the whole church service would be stopped until the sound of that train going through would stop.
Who was the reverend at the time?
Oh, I really do not remember,
Okay.
and I have to apologize because there was several that were good
Right.
pastors.
Well, I went to that church for a lot of years, so. So when you went to school, Harlow Mower already had a store built on the south side of Bridge Street.
Yes, and in fact, at that time, the Mercures owned that store.
Did they own that store at that point in time? Because Harlow built it in about 1932 or 33.
Well, I'm assuming the Mercures purchased that sometime after, because I cannot remember. I think Harlow was retired and living at his home at that time.
Where was his home? Do you remember where his home was at that time?
As you go down Bridge Street, it was the first house on the right-hand side.
Okay.
He lived with his daughter, which was the town clerk,
Mm-hmm.
and she was Grace Moore, and her sister, Laura Moore.
Right. So you knew those two.
I knew those two.
There was one owner, actually it's a leasee between Harlow and the Mercures, but they were only there a short period of time. It may have been, I don't remember the date. It was right in that period of time. So, did you ever get into that store?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah?
I stopped there many times with my 2 cents or whatever I might have to buy penny candy.
Okay, that's when Clarence ran the place.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. And, so we've got a window actually in that building, which is right next to where the gas pumps used to be, which I understand we're going to call the Clarence Mercure window because that's where he used to sit. You remember that?
That part I don't remember.
Yeah. And the post office was over on the other side of the building.
Yes.
And that was, who was in the post office then?
The postmistress was Mamie Marsh.
Right. Okay.
And my sister's before me, but I also delivered the Burlington Free Press.
Oh, okay.
It was shipped to Sheldon to the mail, and we'd go pick up the Free Press and deliver from that building. And quite often we would have to wait for the mail to come in order to deliver the paper. Mamie Marsh would often let us go in a portion of the post office that normal public would not go in because it was the stove
Right.
to keep you warm.
Yeah.
And I remember that as a memory of Mamie Marsh.
So you delivered the paper in the creek or out on outside the creek, or where did you do it?
Primarily on both sides of the creek in the village of
In the
Sheldon.
village.
Yes.
Okay, so that that can be a interesting experience in the middle of wintertime.
Yes, and our customer base wasn't very large, and it was a large for a young guy to carry those papers from one end of the village to the other, and that's basically what it was.
Were you probably 13, 12, 13?
I was still in grade school,
Okay.
and I probably was, maybe 12 to 13, yes.
Okay. The new town clerk's office was built around 1952 to move from where Harlow's store was up to the top of the hill. You must have been there around for that.
The town clerk's office
Right.
was moved up there,
Right.
and the library.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I do recall while the building was being constructed, crawling through the framework and into the attics and that type of thing, as kids were prone to do if,
Oh,
if
yeah.
left unsupervised, I
Right.
guess.
So when you were not walking on the bridge dangerously or crawling through the town clerk's office, what other things would you and your friends find for entertainment?
Well, there's a lot to explore in the bridge area around the rivers. We did fish in the river, but
You did fish in the river. Yeah.
yes,
I've only talked to 2 other people who actually fished in the river.
no, we did fish down there, and both sides of the bridge, but primarily on the downriver, downstream side. On either side, it wasn't necessarily an easy way to get down because you had to go by the old stone foundation that was over there. That stone foundation was also a source of discovery for a young person because people used it as a dump.
There was one on the east side of the creek and the north side of Bridge Street.
north, I'm trying to get my.
As you cross the bridge, it'd be on
Yes,
the
it would
left.
be the north side,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay, all right.
And that dump was constantly being burned by accident or on purpose. So it was, a pollution, obviously. Across from that foundation, there was another smaller building, and I'm not sure. I think it's where they had a skating rink. I don't know if they still have the
Yeah,
skating
they
rink.
do.
Was a shop owned by Kenneth Waite.
Okay, what was the shop for?
Well, Kenneth was a plumber,
Okay.
so my first experience of ever seeing a blowtorch or someone soldering with the use of a blowtorch, Kenneth was the guy that kind of showed us young people some of that type of stuff.
He was still having a little industry down on Bridge Street near the creek.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that's because the fire that happened 10 years before you were born pretty much wiped that area out.
Yes.
It's interesting that it was still an enterprising area 10 years later. The Masonic Lodge used to be down there.
This Masonic Lodge, before it was a Masonic Lodge, was a grain store.
Right, Green Store, yes it was.
Yes. And again, I frequented that place on occasions
When it was a grain store.
when it was a grain
Yeah.
store. And it wasn't there very long, but I do recall the train would deliver boxcar loads of grain and set it on the siding, and they would unload from there and bring it up to the grain store. So they would have to travel from the
So it was bags of grain.
bags of
Yeah.
grain.
Okay.
And we got involved, or I got involved in that with my father, because we had a couple cows that we had at our house.
That was the house on Main Street.
That was the house
The
on Main
pasture land down behind between there and the creek.
Yes, that was not our land, but we rented it.
Right.
It also had been probably, and I'm guessing this because I don't know for a fact, there was no active use of that land at that time, but the Stevensons that lived on the corner of the Main Street and Bridge Street,
Mark and Lena. Yeah.
Mark and Lena, we called her Aunt Lena,
Oh yeah.
and Uncle
Didn't we
Mark.
all?
He had a barn that had several stalls or stanchions for cows in there, so I'm assuming that that's where he pastured his cows.
Probably. Yeah. The experience of growing up means you got to a certain age where, at least since I know you're my generation, so I know it got to an age when things like the newspaper peddling became important because it made money.
Yes.
It also gave you something to do. Well, that would have been when you were still in grade school, and then you become a junior high school student before you graduate and go to on to high school. So were you working at that particular period of time for anyone significant?
Well, the town hall had many functions in it, and a lot of times the setup of the chairs, the cleaning up of the hall afterwards, I would do that for I don't know what I got for a fee for that, but it wasn't
Yeah.
very much. But Mabel and John Kavanaugh at the time were sort of overseers of it, and so I kind of worked for them. I also did odd jobs and chores for John and Mabel Kavanaugh. I milked cows for John in Mabel while I was still in high school.
Okay, so that would have been maybe by milking machine by that point in time?
Yes, it was
Okay.
milking machine. Yes, yes. Which glad that was for.
You mentioned another farm that you worked on. Was that when you were in high school that you worked for Cattell?
Yes. Soon, John and Mabel ended up having to sell their herd off, and it was kind of a sad day for them as well as a lot of people. But I did get offered a job, and I was approximately 13 years old, with the Cattell Farms, Alan and Faye Cattell, the farm is up in East Sheldon. I worked there on summers primarily, and occasionally they would have me to help out when school, like holiday time and stuff like that.
So primarily your job was to go to school, but you worked on the farm
Right.
sometimes after school and sometimes maybe weekends or something of that nature.
And help out sugaring time. when
How far
carrying-
was that from home?
Oh, that was, boy, I'm guessing it's gotta be 5 miles or more.
You got there how?
Well, primarily, my father would drive me there
Okay.
at that time, and if I needed to ride down to the village for weekends or something like that, my father would kind of have to come get me.
One of the last one-room schoolhouses to close in Sheldon was right at East Sheldon. You remember ever having seen that building?
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe when I did see it, it was pretty much a shell because there wasn't much of it. I don't think there was even doors on it or something at that time. But my father lived primarily in Franklin County all his life. He graduated from Swanton High School, but he went to school in a one-room a schoolhouse on Rice Hill,
Okay. Yeah.
and he showed me that where the foundation would have been. It was long gone by the
Right.
time he showed me that, but I remember doing that with him. I do know there was another schoolhouse closer to the small church on Rice Hill that was converted to a house.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that one's still there. I'm not sure.
There also may have been one, and I'm not sure because that's only rumored to me. I've never had it proved, but right in Sheldon, near Crow Hill, where the entrance, where you go up Crow Hill, to the left of that, and I think that's the Bouchard Road or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that first house on the left might
could be.
have been a schoolhouse.
Might have been. I don't have any history that says anything about that.
Yeah.
Very well could be.
I do know there was people that had lived in the house, but it is rumored that as a kid, that it used to be a one-room schoolhouse type of thing. It was a small building.
Where did you decide to go to high school?
I decided to go to BFA in St. Albans.
Okay.
And
You were,
graduated from there.
you were there for 4 years. How did you get to school? Was there a bus at that point in time?
The bus, there was bus, and the bus driver that offered the service was Homer Fairbanks.
There you go.
And but there was times that I rode with other friends when they got old enough to have their car to drive themselves.
Who was one of those friends?
Bertie Spalding's brother Bob,
Okay.
he and Gary Phillips and myself would drive back and
Bob
forth.
Spalding is the one that still has the farm on the corner where the Sheldon house was established. And Gary Phillips went on to become a banker for.
Yes.
That's the one we're talking about.
That's the one.
Well, I know them both. I knew Gary. Guess Gary's gone now, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were it was the usual kind of 1950s high school experience.
Yes. We had a close group of friends in Sheldon that we rode to school on buses together and that type of thing. We have there were some people that are even from Fairfield, which is not far from where
Right on the line, right.
the village was.
Yeah. So you mentioned the name of the guy that owned Dairyland.
Homer Fairbanks?
Right.
Yes.
Were you ever in there?
Yes. The Dairyland was actually the first place I ever had a banana split.
There you go.
And
And when was that?
Oh boy.
How old were you? 14, 15?
No, I think maybe younger than that.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact age. I can remember the building going up. I remember my sisters introducing me to the. They were a little older, so they probably were more mobile than I was, at least from getting from the village of Sheldon to the dairy.
Right. They probably knew Jane too, huh?
Yes, my oldest sister and Jane were friends when she lived in the village. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And another place that was there that you've mentioned was closer to hand, and that was at that point in time called the Portland House.
Yes.
Now, the Portland House was the only surviving hotel from Sheldon's hotel boom years. It burned at one point in time and then was rebuilt. And actually it's still there. So tell me about, did you go into Portland House?
We had an occasion to go in there. Pretty much as a young kid, we didn't do much hanging out there because it was a operating hotel.
Right.
I had friends that lived there, and we would play together, but mostly away from there. I do remember sitting on the porch. It was kind of a wraparound porch in the front on a swing, but we were shooed away several times probably when we were doing that. I'm not sure which one of my friends that lived there, his parents either ran it or owned it, and I got in trouble one time by discovering a dead skunk out behind the building, and then tried to go in the kitchen of the hotel. So that was one of my experiences with the Portland Inn.
So you got a little mischief there, but you never went in for dinner.
It never. Well, yes, we
Did you?
did, because my grandfather and grandmother, who lived in St. Albans Bay, celebrated their either the 25th or 50th anniversary. The actual time of that was confusing to me, but we as a family all gathered there, so we did have a meal at the Portland Inn through that occasion.
It surprises some people to realize that there was a hotel and an accommodation that big in Little Sheldon, even into the 50s and 60s,
Yes.
before it ended up being purchased by Napoli, that's Smith Napoli's, and turned into a different accommodation. But yeah, that one's still there. There was a fairgrounds in Sheldon before you were born. The only thing that remained of it was something that became known as the Rainbow Room down at the junction. You ever remember being down that building?
Yes, but more as an adult. We
Yeah.
did celebrate on New Year's Eve one time there at the
I've talked to people
Fairgrounds.
who went to dances at both the Portland House and the Rainbow Rooms.
Okay. Portland House, I don't recall any
Yeah.
dances. Probably I was just too young for that.
But occasion, mostly when you were growing up, things were happening at the town hall.
Yes.
Yeah.
We had many record hops
Uh-huh.
at the town hall
Right.
as teenagers.
And the school was still there, so pretty much focused right in the creek. You didn't spend too much time in other parts of Sheldon.
No, primarily was the creek. We traveled far and wide from the creek, but our home base obviously was home. We would, on occasions, as kids, we would walk to Fairfield Pond to go swimming in the summertime. I did fish often some of the railroad bridges down near Sheldon, in the Sheldon Junction. We did search for Dobsons in the Missisquoi River, which is down behind what's now the Dairyland. So our range was quite broad
Yeah.
as kids.
So explain what a Dobson is.
Well, it's the nymph of I guess a fly of some kind that like a spring fly or something like that. I don't really know the name of
They're
it.
used
But we
for-
used it to sell for bait.
You sold it for bait.
Yes.
Because I know some people use them for fishing for bass, and they were primarily at the outlet of Black Creek into the Missisquoi, right down on the old Bouchard Road Bridge, right in that area.
Yes, we fished off on that. My recollection mostly of that, the smaller bridge, is that with the Black Creek running into Missisquoi, the confluence of that section right there, in the summer times the waters would be a lot warmer and shallower in Black Creek, and we would watch the large suckers and they would be sitting there under the bridge in the shade of the bridge facing upstream of the Black Creek to try to get as much oxygen as they could out of there.
They wouldn't bite on anything.
But they wouldn't bite on it.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
We similar would watch the bass on the bridge in the village. If you looked over it and on the south side of the bridge where the water would start gaining speed going over the rocks, you'd see the bass there doing the same thing, pointing upstream to try to get more oxygen, I guess, out of the water.
So what would you be doing in the wintertime?
Primarily, the hill behind their cell, our house, my brothers and sisters and I would slide on that quite often. But one of the biggest thrills we had was we would go down to the Portland House Hill and slide in the main road. The paving, the asphalt paving ended right at the top of that hill, and it turned to a dirt road from that point on,
That's the road going to Fairfield.
headed towards
Okay.
Fairfield. Yes.
Big Hill.
And it was worn down, packed down, and icy, and it was a tremendous thrill to go down that hill on our sleds, and in particular at nighttime.
Nighttime. Okay.
So we could see the car lights. That would give us plenty of warning there's a car coming. The other things that we would do was go up to the Spaldings, and their house sits up on the hill, just on the edge of town, and we'd slide down their driveway, which is a little bit more dangerous because we crossed Main Street.
Absolutely.
Quite often we would cross Main Street and end up in the driveway of the house across the road.
Yeah.
So winters were pretty eventful and fun.
You got out quite a bit, and parents sent you on the cold.
Yes.
And most of the winter time you were not off farming.
No, it was not.
You mentioned friends who drove to BFA. What and when was your first motor vehicle?
I never owned a vehicle until I got out of the service.
Okay.
I used my father's vehicle once I got my driver's license.
Okay, so you went into service right after high school?
I was 17, yes.
17.
I just graduated in June, and I left for the Navy in September.
You were in the Navy.
August, excuse me, August.
So it's 17, that would have made that 59?
60,
60.
1960.
1960, okay. And where in the world did you end up over, what, a 4-year period of time?
I was on what they called a kiddie cruise, so it wasn't quite a full 4-year stint. In order to join the service at 17, I had to have my father's signature. And legally, I could not serve beyond my legal age, 21, I think it was, or something like that. So I only served 3 years, 3 months, and so many days because of the way the calendar worked out and my birth date.
Right.
And I served in the Navy on board an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And being in a long ways away from home, I didn't come home very often.
Right.
When I did come home, it was by train. And I traveled across the United States at least 3 times by train.
By train. Wow.
Leaving from St. Albans and ending up in California, Southern California.
That wasn't a day trip.
That was not a day trip. We would go from St. Albans to Montreal to Chicago to Los Angeles, the outskirts of Los Angeles.
Long ride.
It was.
And then after that, it'd be a long ride on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific.
Yes. The aircraft carrier that I was on was an anti-submarine warfare carrier, and it was not wartime at that particular point in time. But our mission was to recover the capsules from the space.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And our ship recovered 2 astronauts, Wally Schirra and Gordon Cooper.
Okay.
I was on duty at the time for one of them, so I wasn't able to do any picture taking. The second one I was not. I was able to get up so I could watch the rescue or the actual lifting of and I had a video camera, a 8mm camera at that time. I took pictures of it.
Well, that's interesting because you were someone
part of
involved in the very pioneering of space.
Part of history in that
Yeah.
respect, yes.
So there are people who I've talked to who were in the hot air balloon thing and dirigibles and all of that, but things moved really quickly.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. And you mustered out.
Yes.
And that you would have been 2021.
I celebrated, I was out before I turned 21. I celebrated my 21st birthday at home in Sheldon
At home in Sheldon. So you moved back to your mom and dad's house
for a very brief period of time.
brief period of time. And at that point in time, you did what?
I ended up trying to get a job, a full-time job at the paper mill. My father was still working there, and I guess that was my ambition, is just get a job and continue what my father did. I did not, I was trying to get more into the office, which was an 8 to 5 job or whatever that time, at that time.